As Zimbabweans await the outcome of their national elections, following the proclamation to extend voting due to delays, the question of democracy on the African continent once again comes under the spotlight. Good evening, welcome to tonight's Unfiltered. My name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. 14 more African countries will soon go through their own elections, but does it say anything about democratic progress on the continent? Added to these are repeated coups in West Africa and Central Africa, despite the existence of oversight bodies like the African Union and other regional institutions. Tonight we ask, how committed is Africa to democracy? Joining me to discuss this are Good Governance at WITS academic Dr. William Mpofu. And on Zoom, we're joined by Professor of History and International Relations based in Kenya, Professor Macharia Munene. And from Lesotho, we have former Director of Political Affairs at the African Union, Professor Kabele Matlosa. Currently with the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Do remember to tweet us at Unfiltered SABC. But first, let's watch this insert produced by Andrew Mokhatle.
As the people of Zimbabwe, we will not allow the Western countries to dictate to us. We don't dictate to them. This interference from outside is unacceptable. We as a sovereign state and a member of the United Nations, we have a sovereign right to run our elections uninterfered.
Pulling no punches last month while on his campaign trail, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa rejected criticism of pre-election developments seen as tantamount to the state's strategy to frustrate the opposition and further narrow the space for democratic expression. Since voting started yesterday and following the proclamation to extend voting due to delays caused by the absence of the voters' roll in many voting stations, the situation remains reportedly tense, with citizens awaiting the final outcome of this national election. Since 2000, Zimbabwe has been accused of state-sanctioned strategies to prevent citizens from expressing their free will. Contrary to expectations that his leadership would be different, following the 2017 coup that ousted former President Robert Mugabe, President Mnangagwa's current Zimbabwe remains marred by similar complaints of interference with opposition campaigning, political intimidation and arrests, manipulation of the voters' roll, and restrictions on freedom of expression, amongst others. And for many years, the story of Zimbabwe continues, with its citizens forced to live abroad despite regional and continental structures established to entrench democracy and human rights across the continent.
Zimbabweans are peace-loving people. They need the support of the entire world. They need the support of the region and the continent. Stand with us.
As Africa increasingly asserts its voice in the world, the thorny issue of democratic practice in some countries muddies the waters as the continent tries to convince the world to take it seriously. Following the Zimbabwean elections, 14 other countries will soon hold their elections, from Eswatini, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Madagascar, many of which also face serious political challenges. In addition, the resurgence of a wave of coups is adding to the concerns. According to the July United Nations report on coups in Africa, instead of decreasing, the unconstitutional power takeover trend is increasing. In under 3 years, 9 coups or attempted power grabs were seen in West and Central Africa. Last month's military takeover by the Presidential Guards in Niger saw the country's President Mohamed Bazoum being held hostage in his palace. a group of Malian colonels led by Assimi Goïta ousted President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in August 2020. In Chad, the army took power after President Idriss Déby was killed on the battlefield in April 2021. 5 months later, Special Forces Commander Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya ousted Guinean President Alpha Conde in September 2021. In January 2022, Burkina Faso's army ousted President Roch Kabore, and since then, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who took power, has been captivating the world with his radical and anti-colonial moves against France and Western countries. While these coups have been condemned by various leaders, others have welcomed them as a new wave of democratic aspiration that is expanding across the continent as overwhelmingly young populations grow frustrated with existing economic and political systems, demanding more rapid change than what elections can deliver. The United Nations report says there is a possible regional level escalation which may see the military juntas in Mali, Guinea and Burkina Faso teaming up to challenge the region's traditional response to coups. Andrew Mokhatle, Unfiltered, SABC News.
A fascinating moment for democracy on the continent. Dr. Mpofu, can I start with you and the crucial election that's happening in Zimbabwe as we speak? We've heard President Mnangagwa come out with an extraordinary proclamation extending voting by a day. Opposition leader of the CCC, Nelson Chamisa, saying we've seen Stone Age style rigging. What do you make of the election in Zimbabwe right now?
What has happened, Sizwe, over time is that elections have been repeated in Zimbabwe, first as a tragedy, then next as a farce, as Marx taught us. Right from the time when the Zanla guerrillas and their political leaders emerged from the bush, scholars have observed, they emerged possessed and intoxicated by a one-party state psychology, where they were not going to brook any political opposition, and where they were going to deploy force and fraud to force electoral and political victory. And things have not changed. The Kukuraundi genocide that happened soon after Zimbabwe's independence was based on ZANU-PF and ZANLA intending to eliminate ZAPU as a political opposition and institute a de facto one-party state under the life presidents of one Robert Mugabe and the one-party state of ZANU-PF. And that has not changed. This bullying of the opposition, this use of lawfare to elbow out alternative candidates is all based on that colonial desire for one political party to become a political cult that will rule the country in perpetuity. I call it a colonial desire in that the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, as it is in many other African countries, did not lead to liberation, but to the democratic experiment. That was a short circuit. You don't democratize before you have liberated. What happened is that the political class in Africa that was fighting the colonial class of settlers also became colonial. That voice of Emmerson Mnangagwa that you are listening to is not the voice of a democrat, it's not the voice of a liberator, but the voice of a native colonialist, saying to the world, allow me the right to bully my own people, exploit the resources of the country, clobber the political opposition because I am a native. That's native colonialism by any other name.
And we will be hearing from one of our reporters on the ground in Zimbabwe to add some texture to the questions of what's happening right now. Professor Matlosa, thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you with us. Can I get your thoughts on the credibility of the election happening in Zimbabwe, particularly from your vantage point, not only as an academic, but also someone who's worked closely with African Union and the African Union Commission?
Thank you very much, Sizwe, for inviting us to this important discussion. And also let me thank my colleague who spoke first, Dr. Bofu, is it? Thank you for that introductory remarks. And let me also recognize our panelist from Nairobi. It's my pleasure to be part of this discussion. Actually, I'm delighted to be part of this conversation because not only did I serve at the African Union in this particular field of governance in Africa, I also developed the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance that was adopted in 2007 by the African Union and came into force in 2012, if I recall. So, the subject of our discussion is quite close to my heart. In fact, I also spent about 4 years in Harare, so I'm familiar with the context there. Now, to the question directly. The situation, I think, that is, has been described by Dr. Mpofu is quite apt. I want just to build on that so that we have a clearer context of these elections. One issue that we should appreciate is emanating from the one-party political culture in Zimbabwe over the years, followed by that was under the late President Robert Mugabe, followed by the dominant party once the multi-party setup was adopted, creates an environment where, in fact, the political governance arrangement is dominated by one single party, ZANU-PF, that has been in power since 1980, 43 years. That's important. That's one issue that we should bear in mind as we assess the environment there. Second is that not only is the ZANU-PF so hegemonic and dominant on the governance architecture of Zimbabwe, but it has also successfully built strong alliances with the security sector. You talk of the army, you talk of the police, you talk of the intelligence, all of them. They are actually working hand in glove with the ruling party, ZANU-PF. And this then, thirdly, creates an environment where the opposition is faced against a very Herculean task, is faced with the Herculean task of trying to dislodge a dominant party that has been in power for so long, 43 years, and also in alliance with the security sector. Now, talking about the security sector, I just want to highlight that only last night, the police raided, this is the information I just got now, the police raided the offices of the civil society agencies, Electoral Resource Center and the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network, and confiscated equipment that these civil society organizations were using to monitor the elections and also work on the parallel voter tabulation, which is a legal thing that happens all the time. Even in Zimbabwe, it's not the first time it's happening. But the police raided them and confiscated the equipment, laptops, cell phones, etc. All the equipment that these civil society organizations were using. And they then arrested 41 of the staff of these two organizations. Now, this goes to show, it gives a clear picture of the environment as it exists. Then we can just then postulate what will be the outcome of a process like this.
Right, and
in an environment that is, yes.
No, indeed, and I think that's important context, particularly around the 40 or 41 or so people that various groups have spoken about as being detained. There's been questions of voter suppression. Lawyers for Human Rights have also vocalized their concerns. Professor Munene, in the context of our discussion, and thank you for joining us, you've been an interesting voice on African elections, the Kenyan election most recently. What are your views on the credibility of this Zimbabwean election and its importance for democracy on the continent more widely?
Well, Zimbabwe has been a regular challenge to the concept of democracy, the practice and the theory. And in part because Zimbabwe gets a lot of attention, in part because of its transition from the Smith regime to now independent Zimbabwe. And for a long time it had that problem that it could talk about the friction with the colonial master, Britain, that tried to continue controlling events in Zimbabwe by other means. And it became very clear what was going on. As of now, yes, there have been accusations and there are points of truth that the state has not been very kind or very nice to its opponents. But I think the election this time in Zimbabwe is not so much whether Mnangagwa wins or whether Chamisa wins. We have a revolution taking place. Chamisa has already made a mark, whichever way it goes. He is a child of post-Smith developments, being about 40-something years. He's almost half the age of his opponent. So you have a father and son competing. And the excitement around Chamisa is different from the way Changirai used to appear. Changirai had a different image. But Chamisa seems to be projecting and generating some excitement that sounds and seems fresh. Whether it's enough for him to win the election or to be declared the winner is another matter. But there is a new mood in Zimbabwe that may be seen to be similar to what's going on in other places in the continent, whereby there is a challenge to the old generation, a generational challenge that the accusation being that the people who brought independence, or the sometimes considered to be the saviors of their places, have failed to deliver on the expectations, and partly because the expectations are also different. So it is a different ballgame here we are seeing. Yes, the credibility is always there. It will not be the first time, and it is not going to be the last time that there will be questions of credibility here and there. Whether one believes them or not is not the issue. But the mood, the changes that are taking place are very noticeable. They penetrate, and they cannot be ignored one way or the other. So the issue of credibility is not a new one, or lack of credibility is not a new one in Zimbabwe and many other countries. And sometimes the losers are very good at making noise about the credibility once they've lost. And they are very good at saying it was fair when they win. So we have that kind of challenge that occurs in many places.
Indeed, and let's go to a break with that backdrop. We're going to try and bring you a voice from the ground through one of our reporters who's in Zimbabwe at the moment. But we're talking democracy in Africa, of course. There's a crucial election happening in Zimbabwe right now. We're also going to come back and discuss the wider context of the Sahel region and a series of coups that have swept across that part of our continent. Don't go anywhere as we discuss democracy in Africa.
Jay, when we were watching Simunyamara, we were dancing mobile room divider.
When men made us feel at home and 50-50 was just a show on TV.
That's because they were scared.
Now we're learning lessons from the real bads on the estate and Guyana.
Hotspot Sally says mum just right for the weekend.
Paying our TV licenses keeps industries alive. Let's stay informed, educated, and entertained.
Telling stories for the now generation. tvlic.co.za.
A father of 5 children is still in prison after being convicted of attempted murder, child neglect and abuse 5 years ago. The house of the so-called Springs Monster and his wife was later dubbed the House of Horrors. Now their eldest son, Herman, talks about what happened behind closed doors. That's in this week's Focus. Incisive and insightful. Friday evening at 8:30 on SABC2.
Zimbabwe heads to the polls in August to usher in a new parliament and to vote for a new president. This as millions of Zimbabweans find themselves caught in a wave of inflation, unemployment, poverty and uncertainty. Join us on SABC News as we bring you rolling coverage of the 2023 Zimbabwean elections. SABC News, independent, impartial.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. We are going to take a voice from Zimbabwe, where the election is currently unfolding, and we're joined by Kaelihle Khumalo. Kaya, thank you so much for joining us. And what are you hearing at this crucial moment of the election, and what are your reflections on dramatic second day of polling?
Well, undoubtedly, Sizwe, it is crunch time in Zimbabwe, as now officially the counting process has started in earnest in light of the extension of the elections, especially for those polling stations that were affected. So we got an opportunity to crisscross, especially here in Harare around the capital, where quite a number of polling stations were affected by the logistical issues, and quite a number of voters were quite ecstatic to have an opportunity. And a lot of them really, they were saying it was a moment of redemption for the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission to have this opportunity to allow them to vote. In fact, we do understand some voters, Sizwe, actually slept in those voting stations. So far, really, the results that have started trickling in will have to be the parliamentary seats. So it's quite a very early days, of course, just to tell you in terms of whether who's gaining the majority, who's getting a landslide victory or anything to that effect. But also it's quite a very important day for Zimbabwe. We do understand as well the observer missions from the Southern African Development Community, from the Commonwealth, from the African Union that is led by former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan. They'll start now to give their reports. But there was a bit of an indication from the SADC region led by a former Zambian vice president who really raises concerns about the late delivery of the material, the voting ballot, especially in those stations, predominantly in the urban areas.
That's fascinating and interesting to hear about the joy and the relief of people being able to vote who thought they would be denied. What is your sense of the credibility of this election? Of course, we've heard a number of reports of suppression leading up to the election, as well as these problems with ballots in key metropolitan areas. Do you have a sense yet of the sense of credibility of this election?
Well, especially because, Sizwe, from the very outset, there was a very clear commitment and assurance from the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission chairperson, Ms. Priscilla Chigumba, who said they'll make sure that the material are delivered on time. But that wasn't the case, really. So it has really raised an eyebrows in so many respects as to how could this happen, especially given the history of the elections in Zimbabwe, where there's always quite a series of questions. when it comes to the credibility element. So it really depends who you speak to. So those who are really happy with the status quo in Zimbabwe, they're quite happy with the current situation. So they do say that, look, these are just challenges that are facing the commission. But also on the other side, mainly from the opposition supporters, they do insist that the commission should have known better, especially when it comes to credibility, impartiality in running these elections. But also, this was supposed to be a very important moment for Zimbabwe, Caesar. You know that these are 9th elections for Zimbabwe since 1980, when they got independence from Britain, but also 2nd elections since, of course, without the name of the former president, the late Robert Mugabe. And also, it was a time really also for the incumbent, really, President Mnangagwa, to make sure that these elections really do happen in a very good environment, especially because he's very confident of the victory as well. And we also spoke to the opposition leader, which is, of course, the Triple C national spokesperson, Caesar, who gave us an indication that the voter suppression really has been a major concern, but also casting aspersions on the conduct of the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission, saying that it's quite embarrassing how they've fared so far, and that they should have really anticipated some of these issues, but also speaking about the issue of making sure that the will of the Zimbabweans must be respected, especially because this country is really facing a litany of challenges, whether you're looking at the economy, whether you're looking at so many sectors, especially because it is a very mineral-rich nation, but it's incredibly, just facing a number of challenges, especially because when you look at what has been said by the incumbent, Caesar, he has been gloating also about his achievements, talking about the issue of stabilizing the currency of Zimbabwe. But of course, it's a bit of a different story when you get to the nitty-gritty of how the Zimbabwean dollar has fared. A lot of people here do say that, well, they don't want to see it because it's always fluctuating, depreciating. A lot of people here do prefer to use the US dollar, which is, of course, quite a very set legacy when you look at how the country has just, in terms of how it's just been facing all these challenges.
Absolutely. Kailihle Kumalo reporting to us from Harare. Thank you so much for the sterling work you're doing on the cutting edge of that election, Kailihle. Dr. Mpofu, we've just heard about the situation on the ground. What do you think about SADC, particularly, and the AU endorsing this election? Do you think they should endorse the election? Do you think we're in a position yet where we can make that call?
Yeah, looking at what is happening right now and what has happened before, it would be important to see African multilateral organizations coming to the rescue of the Zimbabwean populace, not the Zimbabwean political establishment.
How do you think they can do that?
It's by standing with the truth and abandoning liberation war solidarities and minimizing on that principle of non-interference and that unwritten law that African leaders do not openly criticize each other.
So you would advocate for those bodies not endorsing this election based on what you've already seen?
Exactly, because if these multilateral institutions continue to protect regimes, incumbent regimes, especially such tyrannical and such genocidal and fraudulent regimes as Mnangagwa's, we will then see the comeback and the increasing popularity of military coups. Because when legitimate avenues of political competition and contestation are closed, when incumbent regimes use the combination of force and fraud to close up the channels of negotiating and sharing power, the next thing people tend to look up to extra-constitutional means of negotiating power, contesting power, and all that. So it is important that AU and SADC in this case stand with the truth and stand with the Zimbabwean population, not the regime.
Let me put that question to our other guests before we zoom out of the Zimbabwean election. Professor Munene, what's your view on whether SADC and the AU should endorse this election. Do you think we're in a position yet where we can make that call?
Depending on its assessment of what has happened and is happening, if it sincerely believes what it says, then it should say it. It is too early to start prejudging and saying it is this or that. So I would imagine that the delegates, the AU delegates, are diligent and they are serious people and not jokers. And if the evidence as they see it points to whatever, then they should do it. They should not lie to themselves or lie to other people. It is them to make their minds up based on the evidence that they see. If the evidence shows that there is massive theft or rigging or suppression, they should say so. If the evidence also shows that whoever is declared the winner actually did win, they should say so. So the AU should not equivocate on this matter. It should be very clear and give good reasons for taking the position that it does. Failure to do that, then it will be doing a disservice to the continent and to the people of Zimbabwe. Because what we need is to be told the truth, exactly what is it that has happened. And the AU as observers, they should be able to say that.
Indeed, and Professor...
First, for being Africans, but then as independent or supposed independent-minded people who are there to say what they see rather than what they would like to see.
Right.
Or rather than what some other people may want to see.
Let me come to Professor Matlosa on this as well and ask whether you think that the AU and SADC should at this point endorse the election, or what would the process of coming to that, arriving at the decision of that endorsement look like?
Yes, thanks, Israel. I think we need to also be mindful that the AU, in observing these elections, is guided primarily by the 2007 African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. And SADC is also guided by the 2015 Principles and Guidelines Governing Democratic Elections. So then, frankly, they both have to be faithful to the prescriptions that are outlined in those two instruments as they pronounce on the election. And they should not, sugarcoat what they witnessed. They should say it as it is. Fortunately, the election is about to end now, after the extension of the time for those areas in Zimbabwe, like Harare, Bulawayo, Manicaland, Mashonaland Central, where the voting was extended. So we know that immediately after that is done, observers will then call press conferences to pronounce and declare their interim statements on the elections. So once that, then we will watch that space, how they're going to pronounce, that they are genuine, they're honest, they're fair to what they witnessed, and there's no sugarcoating, there's no process of hide and seek in terms of what they saw, what they are pronouncing. So I would suggest that we have to then monitor closely what the observers are going to say in the coming days.
Absolutely. And could we then zoom out of the Zimbabwean case study, which of course is topical at the moment, and sticking with you, Professor Matlosa, turn attention to another development on the continent, particularly in the Sahel region, where we're seeing a rise and a particular spate of military coups, maybe for lack of a better word. We've seen events in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, in Niger. And can I ask what you make of this particular moment in the Sahel region for democracy on the continent? Because in some ways there's a link between the Zimbabwean and Sahel situations, to the extent that some argue that if you don't get the democratic process right and democracy is weak, then the alternative is that military interventions become likely, if not inevitable.
Yes, that is correct, Cesar. And in fact, our discussion on Zimbabwe and then moving from Zimbabwe to the whole continent with regard to military coups, etc., it's an important one, because let's also remember that there was, although this is not said often enough and in the public domain, there was a military coup in Zimbabwe in 2017. That's a fact. Although it was not called as such, but there was a military coup. So Zimbabwe fits, therefore, our discussion on Zimbabwe fits into the discussion on the continent. And what I would say, Cesar, is that I think that we celebrated as Africans. We celebrated and were very optimistic in the 90s when we witnessed the winds, the democratic wave, redemocratization wave. Remember, I call it that, following the collapse of the Cold War and the demise of apartheid in South Africa. We celebrated, and we were optimistic that democracy is on the rise. Democracy would be nurtured and consolidated. But believe you me, since 2006, thereabout, mid-2000s, democracy has been in retreat on the continent. It has been in retreat, and we've seen a spate of military coups on the continent since the 2000s, and that trend of military coups is continuing. We have seen unconstitutional change in the form of sitting heads of state and government tampering with constitutions to prolong tenure in government. This is continuing as well. So I would suggest that we look at this as two sides of the same coin: constitutional manipulation and military coups as trends that are reinforcing democratic backsliding on the continent.
Can I put can I put that interesting proposition to Professor Munene and also suggest what I think is fascinating about what's happening in the Sahel to some extent is that military governments often stand on an anti-colonial platform and become louder in their anti-colonial rhetoric than democratic governments, and this can often solicit public support, and one would think a democratic government speaking on behalf of the people would be anti-colonial, but we've seen very weak democratic governments in their speech on the African continent in terms of colonialism. And so we have this strange situation where coups are in some ways, not universally of course, but getting and gaining some popular traction, particularly in Burkina Faso, for example.
Yeah, we have a wave cutting across the continent, which calls for redefinition of democracy and good governance. Exactly what is it? If the governance, so-called good governance, has meant continuation of exploitation by external forces in the name of democracy, then you have a problem. And what we have seen, particularly in the Sahel area, you look at those people, they are grandchildren of the liberated, or the people who inherited the colonial state. And they do not resonate very well with some things that were said earlier. So what we have in recent times in West Africa, in the Sahel, are not normal coups. It's not just a coup. It is a revolution taking place. And this revolution is not targeting the domestic players, the president, ministers, those are not the issues anymore. So it appears that the target are those extra-continental forces that actually put those presidents and leaders in office and then call it democracy. So you have a rebellion against that. So the seeming popularity of these junta leaders appears to be a response to intensified unhappiness with a lot of the people where they are, and they are told that this is your government, and they have doubts whether it is their government.
Absolutely, we're going to have to go to a break now, but we're going to leave it on that fascinating note, because I think you've opened up a fascinating point of debate about whether what we're seeing is a revolution or just a series of coups. An interesting debate about democracy on the African continent and this particular moment we face in African history. We'll be back with our panel of academics and experts when we return. An election in Zimbabwe, a series of coups in the Sahel region. African democracy is under the microscope this evening, and Dr. Mpofu, we had an interesting intervention from Professor Munene earlier where he described what's happening in the Sahel, indeed in the continent, as a revolution taking place against a certain geopolitical influence from outside Africa. What do you make of that assertion, and how do you understand what's going on in the Sahel right now?
Thank you. And indeed, what my fellow panelist has raised is an interesting subject matter, in that we've seen the increasing popularity of coups, where masses of Africa get into the streets and celebrate that there's been a coup. And that arises from the fact that incumbent regimes that are made out of former liberation movements or movements that arise from former liberation movements have been colonial, have been playing a managerial role where they stand to discipline their people, manage their people on behalf of the international, modern, colonial, capitalist world system that siphons resources and that keeps these African countries in annexation. So these soldiers are deploying decolonial language now. We've had decolonial vocabulary from military men in uniform, and that is because the incumbent regimes have been colonial. Those that challenge them, those that react to them, have no choice but to be decolonial. And it reflects to us exactly that problem where the class that took over power from the secular regimes became imbricated in coloniality and became an avenue through which empire managed to keep the colonial system alive, even without colonial administrations in Africa. So it's not an accident that we have had Sankara-ish speeches from young soldiers actually claiming to be liberators and actually stating how their people have been kept in bondage. Never mind the liberation war or rhetoric of Emmerson Mnangagwa, the language of sovereignty and all that. Behind that vocabulary, there is a sense of entitlement in which these leaders, as long as they have stayed in power, believe that they are entitled to these countries. Like Mnangagwa's slogan that Zimbabwe is Chinu Chedu, meaning our thing, referring to a country. You cannot then blame a young soldier standing up and saying, we will recover the project of liberation from you and restore it to the people. So these soldiers are speaking the decolonial language because the incumbents have been advancing coloniality. That is the revolutionary development that my fellow panelist is describing.
And Professor Munene, what do you make of the decolonial or anti-colonial language here? Do you think this is just a cynical attempt to pull on the heartstrings of populations who haven't actually seen the benefits of decolonization? Or do you think there's actually something genuinely anti-colonial here that is happening on the continent?
I think they are genuine. There is a mood and a serious attitude shift from what it was before. And say that because you look at these people, they are really young people. They are grandchildren. And they have seen some of the things that were said, and they are also very well learned. The way they speak is not the language of ignorant people. So they know what they are talking about. And we have had this discussion before as to where the problem is. Is it because of the continuity of colonialism, in other ways, so-called neocolonialism? And if you see this, the Sahel, the place run formerly by the French, who reportedly imposed the colonial pact as a condition for their continuity, in which France controls everything, from the currency, foreign policy, defense, and the minerals underneath. And people know these things, so they turn around and say, what is this thing? And since they know it, they've gathered enough courage to say no. And so what we have, the leaders, the governments that have been there, are then seen to be overseers in the service of foreign masters. In Kiswahili, we used to refer to such people as the nyaparas, the overseers of the colonial masters' interests. And if they are seen in that context of being nyaparas, then people tend to be very resentful. And what we have now, the people in power cannot anymore claim to be saviors of the country. Because one of the things that was very useful to previous generations was to claim that they were saviors from colonialism. Now they cannot continue claiming that because they appear to be now to be instruments of the very forces that people go against. So the answer to your question, I think these people are genuine. And because they are genuine, that's why you have a revolution. If they were fake and not serious, then it would be just another coup.
Interesting.
And coups you can handle. And what we see happens in the last few times is the world, some people, ECOWAS misread the times and the mood of what was going on. You have France and other countries, they misread. They thought that these were simply the normal coups which you can organize to quell very quickly. And they failed to read the mood, the resentment that is so widespread everywhere. And so when these people come up and they use the right language, they resonate with the ordinary people, because for one or two, I think some of them are part of the ordinary people. They came from the trenches of citizenry.
Right, and apologies
they know the language
to cut you. Apologies to cut you, Professor Munene, but I want to put that interesting perspective to Professor Matlose, because Professor Munene has suggested that he thinks the anti-colonial language and the actions here, there is something genuine about that, and also that ECOWAS has potentially misread the mood in addition to other powers like France. What are your views on that, Professor Matlose?
Yes, let me thank my two panelists in their perspectives on this issue. I concur with what they're saying, but I want to add a dimension to it. That yes, maybe what we are seeing happening with this scourge of military coups in the Sahel, let's not forget Sudan also, Chad, etc. Yes, they're proposing that maybe this is a revolution. I'm not going to question that, but I'm not also going to say 100% I agree. And the reason why I'm saying I'm not going to say 100% I agree is because I want to bring another dimension to this issue. That maybe, just maybe, and a lot of research still needs to be done on this, that this is also a popular protest against the nature of democracy that Africa is implementing. Let us not forget, this is not our democracy. It's a borrowed system. It's a neo-colonial system. And it is not delivering dividend to the ordinary citizens. This is a liberal democracy that fails to deliver bread and butter. That is the immediate need, which are the immediate needs of ordinary African citizens. So this democracy itself is in crisis. And these uprisings that we are seeing, including these coups, could as well be part of a popular protest. But whether that popular protest is a revolution or not, I cannot say it for now. That's one thing I want to put on the table. Therefore, it tells us that we need to embark on a deliberate process of decolonization of democracy on the continent and bringing about a deliberate process of bringing about what is an African democracy, a typically African democracy that is not a copy and paste from the US, copy and paste from Europe, but a typically African democracy, much as it can still be faithful to universal principles of democracy, but it should have its own African characteristics, addressing African problems of unemployment, inequality, hunger, poverty. So that should be the kind of democracy that we should aim towards, a developmental democracy, I want to call it. A social democracy that is developmental in character, not this liberal type that emphasizes only political rights and civil liberties. This is an electoral type of democracy where democracy only exists during elections. In between elections, there's no democracy at all on the continent. So I want to propose that we have a challenge as researchers and thinkers to come up with what is a typically African democracy that is developmental in orientation, that is consensual in character, that is consociational in form. That's my proposal. The second dimension of my intervention is that, and I want to agree with my panelists, the issue that we've been skating around without addressing it directly is the fact that much as we're talking about Africa in the post-colonial era, we have not zeroed in on the fact that much as we're in the post-colonial period, France never decolonized. Even with the nominal independence of Francophone countries in West Africa, France never decolonized. They still kept their colonial arrangements in a different form of pacts, agreements, where these 14 countries, Francophone countries, are hamstrung and kept under France armpit, and their resources are being siphoned day in and day out. And this also brings about this resentment. That's why these military juntas become popular.
Right.
So I think we need to address that as well.
Indeed, and as we close off, I'm going to ask the other two panelists to offer their final thoughts and reflections on what we've just heard. Professor Munene, I'll begin with you. Unfortunately, we're coming to the close of our program, so we don't have much time, but could you just summarize your closing thoughts and reflections based on the provocation of a crisis of democracy on the continent? I think you're on mute, Professor Munene.
Thank you. I think we are going through some interesting times in the continent and in the world. We know that the world is going through some geopolitical reorientation. And yes, Professor Matlosa is right to say that there is an uprising. That's what it is. And uprisings usually grow into revolutions. At least there is a basis for that. There is a revolution going on. And it is a generational one. And in a way, it is positive because it's challenging that neo-colonial mindset. That and it's true that most countries in West Africa, the Sahel and countries, they were given independence. They never fought for independence. They were given independence on condition that they continue being subservient.
Right.
And that's what the rebellion, the revolution is against this subservience that was imposed on that side.
Absolutely.
So it is a positive thing that is taking place in the continent. And if you are going to have coups, have a civilized one like the one that Zimbabwe had in 2017. And they did that. And remember that some of these Western intellectuals, one time we were arguing.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, Professor Munene, but we have got your closing sentiments. Dr. Mbofu, apologies we won't be able to come to you for the end, but we value your insights and you certainly contributed to our show this evening. And Professor Matlosa, I think we need 3 hours for this kind of conversation, but it's been a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion, and we're indebted for your insights and your incisive analysis. Thank you for joining us on Unfiltered. Let's continue the conversation on social media at SABC Unfiltered. Is democracy in Africa in crisis? That's the question we've asked tonight. Have a good evening.